geography. Also, want to acknowledge the support of the African Studies program and the Department of Geography for our speakers' visit today and tomorrow. How many of you knew that last Thursday was World Food Day? It's a very unrepresented. So for those of you who don't know this, this is actually a day that commemorates the founding of the Macalester organization. And it's kind of an opportunity, I think, for those who observe UN days to kind of reflect on progress, but also obstacles to improving the lives of the hundreds of millions of people in the world who deal daily with food insecurity and hunger. And our speaker tonight is someone who has done an extraordinary amount of work, both in academic circles, but also in public fora, to expand understanding of the obstacles to food insecurity and hunger globally, but especially in Africa. Bill Moseley is a professor of geography. He's the chair of the geography department at Macalester College. He's also the director of African Studies at Macalester College. And in his spare time, I guess he also does some, he's also become quite a prolific researcher. Most notably, on top of his many academic publications, including an OU Press title that he co-edited with Leslie Gray, called Hanging by a Thread, Cotton, Globalization, and Poverty in Africa, which we have available for just $18. Steve Howard told me to push some paper today. So he's the author of that book, many scholarly articles. In addition, he has really taken on the responsibility of speaking to wider audiences, and has brought his scholarly findings as well as kind of broader geographic perspective to the op-ed pages of many newspapers. He has a regular column in Al Jazeera. And for that, the Association of American Geographers last year gave him the Media Achievement Award for broadening geographic understanding for the club. So that's my introduction to Bill. We're very happy to have you. Welcome, Bill Moseley.
So thank you, Tom, for the kind introduction, and I want to thank Food Studies, Geography, African Studies, all three programs for helping me come to spend a couple days here at OU. The last time I was here was actually around 25 years ago. My little brother was an undergraduate here in engineering, and I have vague memories of visiting him and staying in the dorms. So it's fun to come back and see this part of the world. I thought perhaps a good place to start would be to tell you, share with you a short vignette, which I think gets at some of the major themes that I'll be sharing with you in this talk. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali in West Africa in the late 1980s. And when I first went there, I spent 4 months being trained in a local language, and learning about local agricultural practices. And while I was being trained, I lived in this small community outside of Bamako, the capital city. So it was in kind of this peri-urban fringe of the city. And so while I was studying and preparing for my Peace Corps service, and I was in this training, I lived with this family. So I came back and I slept with them every night, and I ate with them. They were very generous with me. And so I went on, I did my 2 years of Peace Corps service, and then subsequently I've been very fortunate to go on and develop my work, return several times, and now as an academic I keep returning to the country. And each time I come back, I usually try to go and visit this original family that I stayed with. And I think what's been interesting to me is kind of to notice incrementally over time the changes in their livelihoods and the changes in their diet. And so when I was initially staying with them, they were not entirely kind of into subsistence farming. They were doing some farming, mostly of coarse grains, millet and sorghum. They were growing some peanuts. The father was doing some wage labor to make ends meet. And their diet was principally composed of those things that they were growing. On very special occasions, a marriage or a particular holiday, a Muslim holiday, they would have rice. Okay? But it was an exceptional kind of food. So as I would kind of every 2 or 3 years go back and visit them, I noticed that their diet was slowly beginning to change. They were consuming more and more rice. It was becoming more of a regular part of their diet. And it wasn't oftentimes locally produced rice. A lot of this rice was coming from Southeast Asia. A lot of it was coming out of Thailand and Vietnam. And it was what was called broken rice. It was kind of the dreg rice that other parts of the world didn't want, that they were selling on West African markets. And so I kind of saw this change, okay? And that was also accompanied by kind of less engagement with farming and more engagement in wage labor that they were using to generate the income to kind of buy this food. And that was fine through the 80s and 90s. Rice prices were relatively low and stable, but that began to change in the early 2000s, and that rice prices started going up. There was a big spike in 2007, 2008, and this created a lot of hardship for this particular family, and they were communicating with one another, and this was a big issue. And that kind of one family's experience, okay, I came to learn was being replicated across West Africa, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas. And so I guess, part of my question is why have we seen that dietary transition? Why the switch in this particular case from coarse grains to rice? Why were they consuming rice from Southeast Asia as opposed to locally produced rice? What was behind those kind of rising prices? So those are some of the issues I'm going to be getting at in this talk. I do want to acknowledge two kind of co-authors that helped me write a paper that this talk largely reflects. That's Judy Carney, who's at UCLA, who works in Gambia, and Larry Becker, who's at Oregon State, who works in Cote d'Ivoire. So the talk today, I'll be talking about 3 different countries, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, and Gambia, and my 2 co-authors have specialized in Cote d'Ivoire and Gambia. My work is mostly in Mali, and that's why you're going to hear more about Mali today than those other 2 countries. So in terms of what I'm going to do, I'm going to start very big picture, okay, to give you some background on the 2007-2008 global food crisis. Talk a little bit about what was driving that. Then I want to look at kind of the ways we've been dealing with that crisis, and basically argue that the way we dealt with a similar crisis in the 60s and 70s has influenced how we're dealing with that crisis in the contemporary period. And then I want to get more specific to kind of the West Africa region, look at a series of policy changes that created the conditions for this to become a problem, and then look at these 3 particular countries. That's what I hope to do in the next 45 minutes. So this is a graph of global food prices going back to the 1960s up until 2007, 2008. Okay. We have nominal food prices, which are not adjusted for inflation, and then we have real food prices, the yellow line, that are adjusted for inflation. So what you should notice, okay, is that in the 80s and 90s, global food prices were relatively low, okay, and then they begin to climb around the year 2000, and then there's this big jump up in 2007, 2008. Average food prices jumped about 50%. For some key grains like rice, they went up to 100%. This caused a lot of concern. Okay, but if you go back and look historically, you'll notice that certainly if we adjust prices for inflation, this is not the highest food prices have ever been. They were higher in the 60s and 70s. relative to this contemporary. This is just showing you what happened since then. Prices came back down. They spiked up again in 2011, 2012, but it was a different set of grains for which the prices got high. And then more recently, they've come back down again. So high food prices are a particular problem for the urban poor, who typically spend a disproportionately high amount of their income on food, and their budgets are somewhat constrained. They don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to spend more money on food. And so this particular problem, okay, of rising food prices, did lead to a number of so-called food riots around the world. I'm not particularly fond of the term food riots because I think it kind of connotes it's this kind of spontaneous combustion of anger over a particular issue, kind of dogs fighting over a piece of meat. And I don't think often that's what's happening. It's more people who are upset with the policies of their government that got them into this situation in the first place. So I prefer the term food demonstrations. A lot of these food demonstrations were located in the global south. There's a particularly high number that were occurring in coastal West African cities, so that's where we're going to focus on this particular region. But I do want to highlight that these were not solely occurring in the global south. So, for example, there were pasta riots in Milan, Italy, when that staple food that price became too high. They were rationing rice in a Safeway store outside of Los Angeles, a protest there. So this was also an issue in the global north, for the poor who were kind of struggling to pay for this increasing price of foodstuffs. And this was a great concern to policymakers, and so this has led to a lot of kind of work looking at what led up to this, and then also how this problem can be addressed. So I just want to go through some of the different explanations for why food prices went up. Some of these are long-term reasons, some of these are more short-term reasons. But the one point I want you really to remember is that in 2007, 2008, this was not related to a supply shock. Okay? It's often assumed that if food prices were going up, there must have been a massive drought or something that led to a supply shock. That's not what was going on. So in terms of longer-term drivers, people often point to a growing global population, more mouths to feed. I think I'm going to argue that more significantly than that is the increasingly urban nature of the global population. So if you look at global population trends here in the blue line, we're about 7 billion now. We think we're going to plateau at about 9.5, 10 billion in 2050. Demographers know that with some degree of certainty. But what's, I think, important to state is that in 2010 we became kind of a majority urban world, and it's predicted that we're going to be about 70% urban by 2050. And this is important because as people are moving to urban areas, what they're finding is their diets are changing. They're consuming more processed food, which require more energy to grow, to process, and in particular, they're consuming more meat. And it takes a lot more, about 7 to 10 kilograms of grain to produce every kilogram of meat, depending on the particular type of meat. So by becoming urban, we're putting, and the resulting dietary changes, we're putting more kind of pressure on the global food system. And that is more significant than just the kind of increasing global population. Now, those were our longer-term issues. In the short term, what the global food prices track most closely with are rising energy prices. And the reality is that the global food system is increasingly energy intensive. Many of our fertilizers, our pesticides are fossil fuel based. Increasingly, agriculture is mechanized, and that requires energy. And we're moving food around the globe, which is an energy-intensive process as well. So I don't know if you remember back to 2007, 2008, perhaps you went on a vacation or something, you encountered high prices at the gas pump. And that tracks very closely with these rising food prices. The other issue that's affecting this is increasing use of crops for ethanol production. About 25% of the U.S. corn crop in 2007-2008 was used for ethanol production. It's closer to 40% today. And so that too is it's taking grain out of the food system and putting added pressure on prices. So this, in the energy cost issue and the ethanol production are working together to drive up food prices. Okay. What I'm going to argue is that this particular situation of rising food prices and subsequent food riots or food demonstrations, however you want to label them, generates lots of concern globally. If people are concerned about social unrest, increasingly the U.S. is thinking of this in terms of terrorism, that this is going to create a kind of fertile ground for this to kind of breed terrorism. So we're very concerned about this. And the way we dealt with the last kind of food crisis, period when food prices were high, was through a particular kind of neo-Malthusian worldview. And I think that worldview continues to hold and impacts the way that we're trying to deal with that today. So let me just show you a couple of slides that kind of I'm sure many of you are familiar with Thomas Malthus's ideas that resources increase arithmetically, the population increases geometrically. That's going to put particular pressure on the system. And he talked about how the kind of natural control here is famine. Subsequently, Paul Ehrlich in the population bomb is arguing for family planning in order to address this problem. That was one side of the issue, okay, in the 60s and 70s. The other was there was a huge effort on the part of the U.S. government to increase food production. So it wasn't solely about population control, but the other way they were going to address this was through increasing food production. Their concern then was not terrorism, it was about communism. These efforts were very much kind of framed in terms of an anti-communism effort. So this was rolled out in terms of the first Green Revolution, which largely focused on crops, wheat and rice, that are predominantly grown in Latin America, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And there's a widespread belief that that effort, bypassed Africa. That it didn't focus on crops that were most relevant to the African context. So we need to kind of go back and have a new green revolution that's appropriate for the African context. So that this is circulating in policy circles today. The other way in which this is important to understand is that this first green revolution did increase yields, in particular in Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia. Here you'll see how the yield curve was flatter in sub-Saharan Africa. But because it was successful from the narrow kind of production perspective in these other places, it does create a new kind of group of major rice exporters on the global scene. So if we look at, this is for rice specifically, and this is going to connect back to our story when I bring this back to West Africa. If we look at major rice exporters in the world, we have the U.S., that's heavily supported by subsidies in our country. But then we have Thailand and Vietnam, who are increasingly big rice exporters. And this is a product of that first Green Revolution experience. China, India, Pakistan are all major rice producers as well, but they have huge internal markets, so they're not as big on the export front. So there have been lots of critiques of the Green Revolution. I don't have time to go into them, critiques of that experience in South Asia and Latin America. There are critiques about its social impacts and how it led to differentiation. There are critiques about the environmental impacts. But I think very important for the purposes of our talk is a critique that Amartya Sen is making, Nobel laureate, talking about kind of pointing out how through just increasing food production doesn't necessarily solve the hunger problem. So this whole kind of first Green Revolution was about increasing production, increasing food availability, premised on the belief that there's enough food, if there's enough food there, people will not go hungry. And Sen talked about this notion of entitlements, so how people can grow their own food, they can access it through the market, they can buy it, they can get it from their neighbors, okay? But that entitlement or their ability to access that food is different than the food solely being there. And that was a hugely important distinction because it helped us understand a number of important historical moments when there was plenty of food in an area, yet there was widespread famine. So for example, in the 1970s, there's a massive famine going on in Sahelian West Africa. At the same time, they're exporting peanuts to Europe, which were a source that was rich in protein. So basically, Europeans are outbidding Africans for this important source of protein. So I think Sen is important to keep in mind as a kind of seminal critique of this kind of food supply approach to addressing hunger. So now I want to turn to West Africa. Okay? And so we've kind of seen the global picture. We've seen how the first Green Revolution produced these kind of big rice exporters. Now there's a series of policy changes that are going on in West Africa, starting in the early 1980s, and are going to open up West African markets to this cheap Asian rice. So this is kind of predated by the third world debt crisis, in which a number of developing countries became indebted. There's a risk that they're going to default on their loans. And so the solution that the international financial institutions come back with to address this is structural adjustment, neoliberal economic reform. And they're going to push countries to really focus on a few crops for which they have a comparative advantage that they're going to export. They're going to, very importantly, for the purposes of this talk, remove or scale back tariff barriers, which is going to make it easier to import food. There are reductions in government spending, including large rollbacks in agricultural extension staff that will be working on agriculture in these different African countries. In some, we have privatization of state-run enterprises, and that's going to come up in an example I'll present in a few moments. So this series of policy changes and reforms in the 80s and 90s is critical for understanding why increasingly West Africa becomes dependent on imported rice. Also, during this period, we're seeing increasing rates of urbanization in a number of African countries, and as they're becoming more urbanized, their diets are changing, and so they're also becoming more amenable to consuming rice. I have three charts here, okay? One is showing you in the top left increasing levels of rice consumption in West Africa as compared to sub-Saharan Africa in general. One is showing you production of rice in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa and how it's not meeting all the needs, so this gap is increasingly being filled by imports. And this is not a problem as long as rice prices are low, And then the last graph on the right is showing you how rice prices gradually begin to increase from the early 2000s, and then we have this big spike in 2007, 2008. So that's the context. In terms of the specific research I want to share with you today, we're looking at, what are the policies that led to food demonstrations or food riots in Abidjan, the capital, or the economic capital of Cote d'Ivoire, and Banjul, the capital of Gambia. And why were there problems there? And then when we compare these with Mali, in particular what went on in Bamako, Mali, why was it not as much of a problem there? Why were there not food riots there? We're trying to understand what accounts for this shifting mix of kind of food imports and consumption patterns, and what does this say about kind of vulnerability moving forward? I've already mentioned my collaborators. What I'm going to share with you today is based on fieldwork done over a number of periods, but most importantly, it is based on a set of interviews that we did in the summer of 2009, shortly after this, where we interviewed 30 rural and 30 urban households to try to understand how they were dealing with food prices, rising food prices, and also interviews with policymakers. This is just showing you these 3 different countries that I'm going to be focusing on, showing you how, what was the price of imported rice at the height of this problem in 2008. One thing you'll notice is that imported price was higher for Mali than Cote d'Ivoire and Gambia, and that's because Mali is landlocked, so it just you have an additional transport cost to get that rice into the country. If you look at per capita GNI, Cote d'Ivoire is the wealthiest, and Gambia is the poorest in a comparative sense. If you look at rice consumption, it is by far and away the highest in the Gambia. And there's a long tradition of consuming rice there. It's least in Mali. And very interestingly, in the Gambia, the majority of that rice is imported, 85%. Okay, and it's the lowest in Mali. And we'll just have some comparative population statistics. These are the 3 countries we're looking at. We have a blow-up of the Gambia. These are the major rice-producing areas. Here are the major rice-producing areas in Cote d'Ivoire. In Mali, this is the big rice-producing area, irrigated rice production along the Niger River. They also do this in the southern part of the country, but this is dominated by sorghum and cotton production in the south. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gambia, then Cote d'Ivoire, and then get into a bit more detail with Mali. So after independence, the Gambia has kind of a first phase of food policy, which is really dominated by food self-sufficiency. The explicit goal here was to produce as much food as possible within the borders of the country. And this particular policy objective was shared by many African countries at the time. The Gambia benefited from the PRC and Taiwan at the time fighting for recognition in the UN. So they were eager to cultivate African allies. So they were spending a lot on development projects in order to curry favor. So here you see PRC, Taiwanese, and World Bank rice irrigation schemes along the Gambia River. The idea was that normally there was one rice season, okay, which was traditional, and it had to do with the seasonal kind of inundation of plains along the river, and then the river would recede. The idea was with these irrigated rice perimeters, you could now have 2 seasons. So you'd have 2 rice seasons. And the thought was that one of the seasons would be for food self-sufficiency to secure the household, and then the second season would be for sale. Rice production did increase, although there's this kind of social piece to this, and Judy Carney's written a lot about this, how they just sort of expected that women's labor would double because they were the traditional rice producers of the country. and they kind of push back against this. There were also sort of infrastructure issues that were never adequately addressed, including roads to get the rice all the way to the capital. There was one main rice mill in the country that was happened to be on the wrong side of the river. In the 80s, we have the structural adjustment phase. And so as part of structural adjustment, there's this big rollback in government spending. The donors pull out support. The agricultural extension staff shrinks. And what you see is kind of stagnant or declining rice production. And it's a bit hard to see, but this is increasing rice imports. So they're becoming increasingly less and less self-sufficient in rice production. So this line here is kind of declining domestic self-sufficiency in rice. And my colleague Judy Carney talks about the problem of the two Gambias. Okay, we have upland Gambia, where they're producing rice. They can't easily get it to market. They can't easily get it processed. And then increasingly we have lots of people migrating to urban Banjul, where 2/3 of the population lives. And so even though there's all this rice being produced upcountry, now increasingly they're living on broken rice from Asia. So it's this disarticulated economy. I'm going to turn to Cote d'Ivoire now. Very similar to the Gambia. The focus is on food self-sufficiency in the early kind of independence era of the 60s and 70s. And they're carrying on from the French, who had a big emphasis on increasing rice production in the country. Lots of ag extension effort put into this, lots of government support. And they practically become self-sufficient in the late 1970s. But then we begin to see problems in the global economy. Cote d'Ivoire was a big exporter of coffee, cocoa, timber, cotton. The revenues from these crops are declining, so they end up having to go through a structural adjustment phase as well. So similarly to the Gambia, pulling back of extension staff. Very importantly, the state had 10 to 11 large industrial mills that were used for the milling of rice. Those all got privatized. There was no kind of real buyer, so they eventually get shut down. And what these large industrial mills are replaced by are micro mills or mini mills. So kind of the private sector steps in to begin milling this rice. And I don't know how many of you have ever had poorly milled rice it's not properly clean. There are small stones in it. You can break your teeth. It's not fun. So the Ivorian rice develops a bad reputation amongst urban consumers. So it's not preferred. So not only does it increasingly become cheaper to buy imported rice, but there's a quality issue there as well. So Cote d'Ivoire increasingly becomes dependent on imported rice. Mali is slightly different than the other two countries that we just talked about. It's not as heavily dependent on rice. Rice, in aggregate, only accounts for 15% of the grains that are consumed. The other 85% are coarse grains, mainly sorghum, millet, and maize. However, very importantly, rice is terribly important for the urban population, which is 30% of the country. So their rice accounts for 50% of the food that is consumed. Mali is also importing less of its rice than these other countries, only 20%. So, like Cote d'Ivoire and the Gambia, early on there's this focus, really from the colonial period under the French, moving into the 60s and 70s on food self-sufficiency. The one thing that the French did, was build this large irrigated rice production scheme called Office du Niger. They dammed up the river near Ségou. Initially, they tried to grow cotton there. It didn't work, so they converted to rice. And that's the largest source of kind of rice for the urban population. Mali too goes through structural adjustment. They liberalized the cereal market, but very interestingly, the state did not pull back to the same degree from rice production. They still kept a hand in that Office du Niger project. So slightly different, well, it's a different story than what we're seeing in the Gambia and Cote d'Ivoire. One thing that was significant for Mali during this structural adjustment phase is a huge kind of shift away from food production to export orientation. And Mali's major export crop is cotton. Different interviews I've done with civil servants there was this strong kind of recognition that kind of cotton was the backbone of the economy. Cotton was kind of the source of revenues that paid the state civil servants. They would say, grâce à la CMDT, nos fonctionnaires sont payés. Because of the state cotton company, our civil servants are paid. Now, very interestingly, leading up to 2007, 2008, the global price for cotton got very low. And Malian farmers were not happy about this, and they went on strike. And so, if you look at this kind of period here, late 2000s, and this is cotton production and sorghum production, what you see is that there's an inverse relationship between cotton and sorghum production. When cotton production goes down, sorghum production goes up. And that's interesting and important for a couple of different reasons. It's interesting because the state, in Mali had long argued that cash crop production and food crop production are complementary. That big cotton producers are going to be big millet and sorghum producers. In the local language, they say, the big cotton producer is the big sorghum millet producer. And the idea was that with cotton you could get access to credit, you could buy machinery that you could use on your food crops, you could use that credit to buy inputs that benefited your food crops, and so these two things worked synergistically. That data I just showed you on the previous slide contradicts that, because there we see when cotton production goes down, food production goes up. And in fact, interviews we've done with households show that while this may work for wealthy households, it doesn't hold true for medium and poor households. So it was serendipitous that leading up to the food crisis, cotton production collapsed, and all of a sudden Mali had all this sorghum on the market. And so part of what saved Mali is when rice got too expensive, its consumers could fall back on sorghum. And this wasn't an option in the other countries. So I want to shift now to some interviews that we did with urban consumers in Bamako, Mali. So trying to understand why is this group increasingly consuming rice. We've talked about how increasingly we have cheap Asian rice on the market. It's easier to get down in because of these reduced tariff barriers from structural adjustment. Also because of previous droughts and food aid that came into the country, some people have been conditioned to eat more and more rice. But then, I think very significantly, and this would hold true for the surrounding countries, Mali is urbanizing at a very rapid rate. And Bamako, in some years, is one of the most rapidly growing cities in the world. And I think that also has a lot to do with this shift out of coarse grains into rice. Now, the next slide will get at this a little bit. So when we were interviewing urban households, and we really tried to make sure to interview some of the main cooks in the household, we asked them, why rice? Why is there this preference for rice over coarse grains? These are some issues that consistently came up. One is that it doesn't take as much time to prepare. And so as people moved to the city, traditionally the women were cooks, But when they move to the city, they start working, part-time jobs. Either they have formal employment or they're working in the market, and so they don't have as much time. So rice is just quicker to prepare. Another issue that came up is that rice is kind of associated with modernity. If you're kind of a modern household, rice is highly desirable to eat. And it's kind of critical that this kind of big noontime meal that you offer rice. And that sorghum, millet are kind of peasant food. They would also talk about how rice, even though it might be more expensive per kilo because it expands greatly when you cook it, it fills people up. So the volume you get after cooking is actually much greater than, say with coarse grain. But I think very importantly, and this is different than in Cote d'Ivoire and the Gambia, is that in Mali, if they have a choice, okay, in terms of rice, they prefer local rice over imported Asian rice. And there, the preferred local variety is called Gambia Cote. And I can't tell you kind of how many old grandmothers I interviewed who told me, this Asian rice, it gives me stomach aches, it gives me diarrhea, I don't like it. So there's this strong preference for local rice, if they can afford it, okay? So wealthier households, upper middle income households, even when the local rice is expensive, this is their first preference. And then critically, for these poor urban consumers in Bamako, when that imported Asian rice got more expensive, okay, because of this kind of collapse of cotton and the increasing sorghum production, they could switch into sorghum. It's what economists might call kind of an inferior good, okay? So they can downshift into this cheaper grain. And I think part of the reason that they were this adaptable in their